Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
There's a familiar moment many people recognize immediately. A conversation appears to be ending. The point has been made. The emotional tone is settled. And then someone re-enters the space. Not with new information, not with curiosity, but with the final statement. A clarification no one asked for. A correction that changes nothing. A closing remark that subtly reasserts control. To the outside observer, it often looks petty, defensive, or ego-driven. It gets labeled as insecurity, narcissism, or even a need to dominate. But those interpretations stay on the surface. They miss what's actually happening beneath the behavior. The need to have the last word is rarely about winning. It's far more often about regulation. You see, conversation is not just an exchange of ideas. It's an emotional system. When people speak, they're not only transmitting meaning, they're managing uncertainty, exposure, status, and internal tension inside a relational field. Most people do this automatically, without awareness, but for some, the ending of a conversation creates instability. Silence does not feel neutral. Open-endedness does not feel benign. It feels unfinished in a way the nervous system cannot easily tolerate. Getting the last word in becomes a way to close the loop. This is not about asserting superiority. It's about sealing the system so it can finally settle. For people who rely on conversational sealing, unresolved endings carry a psychological cost. When an interaction stops without a clear sense of control or closure, the internal system doesn't power down. It keeps running. Thoughts begin to circle. Did I explain myself clearly? Did I leave something vulnerable? Did they misunderstand me? Did I lose ground without realizing it? These questions may not even appear in full sentences, but they create agitation all the same. Speaking again provides relief. It restores the sense that the situation has been contained. The content of the last word often doesn't matter. It might be a repetition. It might be a minor correction. It might even be agreement. What matters is that the speaker is the final active agent. That position quiets the system. To understand how strong this drive can be, it helps to look at what happens after the conversation ends. For the sealer, the interaction doesn't conclude when the words stop. It enters a second phase, a post-conversation hangover. The mind begins replaying the exchange, scanning for leakage. Where did I sound uncertain? Where was I vague? Where might I have been misread? This is not reflection, it's internal litigation. The person is both defendant and prosecutor, reviewing the transcript for vulnerabilities. In modern life, this often shows up as the follow-up message, the just one more thing text sent 30 minutes later, not because something new occurred to them, but because the internal pressure was never resolved. That message is not aimed at convincing the other person. It's aimed at silencing the internal prosecutor. It's like an attempt to repair a perceived breach after the fact. From the outside, it can look unnecessary or intrusive. From the inside, it feels essential. This pattern often has developmental roots. You see, in early environments where emotional safety was inconsistent, being misunderstood carried consequences. Silence was not neutral. It meant exposure. Children in those environments learned that endings were dangerous unless they were actively managed. Closure became something you created, not something you trusted to emerge on its own. Over time, that adaptation becomes automatic. The adult doesn't experience it as fear. It simply feels necessary. Conversations that end without a seal feel incomplete, even vaguely alarming. The impulse to speak again arises as a regulatory reflex, not a deliberate choice. This is why shaming the behavior rarely helps. Telling someone they always get the last word frames the issue as a character flaw. But the behavior is not driven by vanity. It's driven by unresolved tension. Criticism increases that tension, which only strengthens the impulse. Now, it's important here to distinguish between conversational dominance and conversational ceiling. Dominance is a pattern of control throughout an interaction, interrupting, redirecting, dismissing. Ceiling is situational. Someone may be thoughtful, cooperative, even deferential for most of the conversation. The urgency appears only at the end. The goal is not to overpower the other person, but to prevent internal unraveling. And there's also a cognitive dimension to this. For some people, thought and identity are tightly fused. What they say feels inseparable from who they are. When a conversation ends without a final articulation of their position, it can feel like a threat to coherence itself. Silence registers as erasure, and speaking again restores a sense of existence. Now, this is not narcissism. It's over-identification with thought. In more differentiated systems, thoughts are tools you use. In less differentiated systems, thoughts are what you are. When that distinction has not fully developed, silence becomes threatening. Cultural conditions have amplified this pattern. We now live inside what could reasonably be called a last word culture. Digital communication rewards closure, not depth. In comment threads, the final reply often appears to win by default, simply by being the most visible. Visibility begins to feel like truth. But at the same time, digital spaces strip away many of the soft signals that used to regulate interactions: tone of voice, facial expression, the nod that says we're okay, the pause that communicates containment. Without those cues, the seal feels more necessary. Words become the substitute for relational safety. The period at the end of the sentence stands in for the reassurance that would once have been conveyed nonverbally. This is not a moral failure, it's a structural shift. A structural shift in how human beings communicate. To see how this plays out in real life, consider two common settings, okay? In professional settings, this often appears as the expert trap, right? A meeting is ending, the main decisions are made, and then someone corrects a small, irrelevant detail. Not because the detail matters, but because accuracy has become a load-bearing wall for their authority. If one small thing is wrong, the entire structure feels compromised. The last word restores internal order. Now, in personal relationships, the pattern looks different, but functions the same way. One partner walks away to cool down. The other follows, needing to finish the point. To the one leaving, the conversation is paused. To the one pursuing, safety is being withdrawn. The last word is an attempt to lasso the other person back into the emotional field so the system does not collapse. In both cases, the behavior is driven by the same underlying mechanism, a low tolerance for unresolved relational space. On the other side of this pattern is a different kind of capacity, the ability to let meaning settle without constant intervention. The ability to trust your position exists, even when it's not being actively asserted. The ability to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing exactly how you are received. This is not virtue, it's buffering. People who don't need the last word are not more evolved or more enlightened. They are more internally resourced. Their nervous systems can hold incompletion without destabilizing. Silence doesn't feel like loss. Endings don't feel urgent. This is why silence can be so powerful. It communicates solidity. It signals that nothing essential is at risk. When someone can stop speaking without anxiety, the entire relational field often settles around them. For those who recognize themselves in the urge for the last word, the work is not suppression. Forcing silence without addressing regulation only increases strain. The work is an expanding tolerance. That expansion begins with noticing the impulse without immediately acting on it. Feeling the bodily urgency, the tightening, the racing heart, the mental pressure to clarify or correct, and allowing that activation to rise and fall without being discharged through speech. A useful internal shift here is the permission to be imperfectly understood, not as resignation, but as stability. If your heart rate is elevated, you are not clarifying, you're surviving. And survival is not the right condition for final truths. Over time, the system learns that silence is survivable, that identity doesn't dissolve when conversations end imperfectly, that coherence does not require constant maintenance. For those on the receiving end of this behavior, understanding the mechanism can change the response. You don't need to engage the last word. You don't need to challenge it. Often the most regulating response is simply not to contest it. Let the seal be placed. The system will settle. The deeper takeaway is this. Conversation is never just about words. It's about the internal conditions that allow words to come and go without destabilizing the self. When those conditions are present, silence is not threatening, endings are not dangerous, and the last word loses its power entirely. Because nothing essential needs defending, and nothing essential is at risk when the conversation ends.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.